The gold leaf of the great hall could not mask the stench of decay, for a kingdom begins to rot from the head down the moment its ruler's heart begins to falter. Before we delve into this tale of a forgotten monarch and the girl who braved the shadows to save him, I invite you to join our community by subscribing to our channel. Your presence honors this story, so please take a moment to like this video, share it with those who believe in the power of unsung heroes, and subscribe to the channel to ensure you never miss a moment of our historical journeys. The Hollow Crown. King Silas of Oakhaven was not yet a corpse, but his children were already measuring the coffin. In the north wing of the palace, the air was thick with the scent of expensive incense and the sour breath of impending treachery. Prince Cassian, the eldest, stood by the arched window, his fingers tracing the hilt of a sword he had not earned, while his sister, Princess Hestia, leafed through a ledger of the royal jewelry. They spoke of succession and transition, words that acted as polite veils for the word death. To them, their father was no longer the man who had carved a nation out of the wilderness. He was merely a roadblock to the treasury. They had spent the last fortnight arguing over which tapestries would be moved to their private estates and which loyal generals would be retired to make room for their own sycophants. The king was still breathing, yet his world was being partitioned like a common map on a merchant's table. 2 floors below, where the air smelled of scorched flour and rosemary, Mina moved like a ghost through the pantry. She was a girl of 20 years, with a face that most people chose not to look at twice, not because it was plain, but because of the faint, jagged scar that ran from her temple to her jaw, a souvenir from a childhood fire that had claimed her home and her family. In the bustling hierarchy of the royal kitchens, she was the lowest of the low, the one who scrubbed the copper pots until her knuckles bled, and organized the heavy sacks of grain in the damp dark of the cellars. But Mina possessed something the princes and princesses lacked, a memory that reached back into the warmth of the sun.
She remembered 10 years ago when the king had visited the village of the charcoal burners during a bitter winter. She remembered how he had knelt in the soot and slush to speak to a frightened, scarred orphan who was being shoved aside by the village elders. He had not looked at her scar with revulsion, but with a deep, weary sadness that felt like understanding. He had reached into his pocket and handed her a silken handkerchief to dry her eyes, telling her that the strongest steel is forged in the hottest fire. He had forgotten that moment the second he rode away, consumed by the weight of 1,000 other duties, but Mina had carried that handkerchief and those words like a holy relic against the cold. Now, hearing the kitchen gossip about the king's inevitable passing and the physician's refusal to enter the old turret for fear of the king's failing lungs, or perhaps for fear of Prince Cassian's displeasure should they actually succeed in curing him, a cold fire ignited in her chest. The palace staff had already begun to wear black, not out of mourning, but as a performance for the heirs. The chefs were preparing a feast for the coronation, while the man who had built the very walls they stood within was being starved of both food and company. The king had been moved to the old turret, a drafty, neglected part of the castle, ostensibly for quiet and fresh air, but in reality it was a tomb with a view. It was a place where his children wouldn't have to hear his labored breathing while they dined on pheasant and drank vintage wines. No servants were sent there except to leave a tray of cold, watery broth at the door, broth that was usually taken away untouched the next morning, pecked at by the ravens that nested in the eaves. The silence of the tower was absolute, broken only by the wind whistling through the ill-fitting stones. "He's gone in the head, they say," the head cook muttered, tossing a wilted turnip into the bin with a wet thud. "A waste of good wood to keep the fire going in that drafty tower. He won't last the week, and then we'll have Prince Cassian to answer to. Better start practicing your bows, girl, and keep that face of yours down. The prince likes things pretty and perfect."
Mina didn't speak. She never did if she could help it. Her voice was a rasping thing, damaged by the same smoke that had marked her skin. But that night, when the moon hung like a silver sickle over the battlements and the rest of the staff had collapsed into their beds, she did not go to her pallet in the attic. Instead, she crept into the hidden corner of the pantry where the medicinal herbs were kept, the ones the royal apothecaries deemed too common for a king, but which the peasant women knew could pull a man back from the brink of the grave. She gathered dried lungwort, elderberry, and a precious pinch of honey stolen from the queen's own jars. She brewed a tea in a small battered tin pot, her movements precise and silent. Her heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird, each throb a reminder of the treason she was about to commit. To enter the old turret was forbidden by the prince's decree. To touch the king was a crime punishable by death for someone of her station. But as she looked at the tray of congealed fat and stale bread destined for the king's door, she felt a surge of indignation that outweighed her fear. The man who had given a handkerchief to a peasant girl deserved more than to die alone in the dark, surrounded by the ghosts of his own greatness and the stench of his children's greed. She took the tray from the servant's station, a young boy who was only too happy to let someone else climb the 300 stone steps in the middle of the night. The stairwell was damp, the torches flickering low in their sockets, casting monstrous elongated shadows that seemed to grab at her skirts. With every step, the silence of the palace grew heavier, a suffocating weight that smelled of dust and forgotten things. This was the part of the castle where the history lived, where the tapestries were moth-eaten and the air tasted of the centuries. When she reached the heavy oak door at the top, she found no guards. Prince Cassian had withdrawn them days ago, claiming it was to give the king peace, though Mina knew it was because there was nothing left to guard but a dying man's dignity, and that held no value to the prince. She pushed the door open. The groan of the hinges sounded like a scream in the stillness, and for a moment she froze, waiting for the heavy tread of the guard. But no one came.
The room was freezing. A single candle guttered on the nightstand, its wick drowning in a pool of wax, casting long, dancing shadows across the peeling wallpaper. In the center of the massive four-poster bed lay Silas. He looked nothing like the lion of a man Mina remembered. His skin was the color of parchment, stretched tight over high cheekbones, and his beard, once a proud chestnut, was now a tangled thicket of white and gray. His chest moved in shallow, jagged hitches, and a thin film of cold sweat covered his brow. He looked small in the vastness of the bed, a fallen titan being consumed by the very shadows he had once commanded. Mina set the tray down. She should have left then. She should have placed the tea and run back to the safety of the flour sacks and the anonymity of the kitchens. But she saw the way his hand, thin and skeletal, twitched on the silk coverlet, reaching for something that wasn't there, perhaps a hand to hold, or perhaps just a sign that he was still among the living. "Your Majesty?" she whispered. Her voice felt foreign in the opulent gloom, a rough sound that seemed to scrape against the silence. There was no answer, only the whistling sound of his breath, a ragged rattle that spoke of lungs filled with the fluid of a failing heart. Mina moved closer, her shadow merging with his. She took a basin of water from the washstand, it was ice cold, and used her own apron to dampen it. Gently, with a reverence usually reserved for the altar, she began to wipe the grime and sweat from his face. She worked with the steady hands of someone who had nothing to lose and everything to give. She felt a strange jolt of electricity when her skin brushed his. It wasn't the spark of a lover, but the profound connection of one human soul recognizing another in the dark. As she cleaned his brow, the king's eyelids fluttered. His eyes, a clouded, piercing blue, opened for a fraction of a second. He couldn't see her clearly. To him, she was a blur of warmth and a soft, melodic humming. Mina had begun to hum an old folk song, a tune about the changing of the seasons, something her mother had sung before the fire. It was a song of survival, of the spring that inevitably follows the hardest winter. "Drink, sire," she murmured, lifting his head with practiced tenderness. She had spent years nursing the other kitchen maids through fevers and accidents. She knew how to hold a body so it wouldn't break. She pressed the cup to his cracked lips. At first, the liquid dribbled down his chin, but then his throat moved. A swallow, then another. The honey and herbs seemed to soothe the raw edges of his lungs, the warmth spreading through his chest like a slow-burning hearth. For the first time in hours, the king's breathing eased. His hand stopped its frantic twitching and settled, by chance or instinct, over Mina's wrist. His grip was weak, the strength of a dying man, but to Mina it felt like a shackle of gold. She sat there on the edge of the bed, a pantry maid in a stained tunic with a scarred face, holding the hand of the most powerful man in the world. In the distance, she could hear the faint, discordant sound of laughter and music coming from the main palace, where the prince was hosting a pre-coronation gala. The contrast was a bitter pill, the noise of the vultures feasting while the lion lay starving. She stayed until the candle burned down to a nub of wax. Before the first light of dawn could expose her, she pulled her hand away, tucked the blankets around his wasted frame, and vanished back into the shadows of the stairwell. She left behind nothing but the scent of elderberry and the first spark of hope Oakhaven had seen in years. She did not know that the king had watched her silhouette retreat, his mind clearing for the briefest of moments, wondering if the gods had finally sent a messenger to escort him to the grave, or if life was calling him back for one final stand against the children he had raised to be his own executioners. The shadow in the sick room. The following night, the palace felt even more like a tomb, though one decorated with the gaudy trappings of a celebration that hadn't yet earned its right to exist. The air in the lower corridors was thick with the smell of roasting meats and expensive wine, but as Mina climbed the winding stone steps of the old turret, the warmth of the kitchens faded into a damp, biting chill. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic rhythm that matched her quickening pace. In her hands she carried a small bundle wrapped in a clean, though threadbare, linen cloth, soft bread soaked in warm milk, and a fresh infusion of the lungwort and willow bark that had seemed to steady the king's pulse the night before. She knew the risk she was taking. If Prince Cassian or Princess Hestia found her here, she wouldn't just be fired, she would be erased. When she entered the sick room, the smell hit her first, the cloying, sweet scent of unwashed skin and the metallic tang of stagnant blood. It was the smell of a man being allowed to rot while he was still conscious enough to feel the indignity of it. The single candle left by the boy earlier had already gone out, leaving King Silas in a darkness so absolute it felt physical. Mina moved with the practiced silence of someone who had spent her life trying not to be noticed. She struck a flint, the small spark illuminating the king's face. He looked worse than he had the previous night. His skin had taken on a gray, translucent quality, and his lips were pulled back from his teeth in a grimace of silent pain. Mina set her bundle down and immediately went to the hearth. It was filled with cold ash, a testament to the heirs' desire to see their father's light extinguished as quickly as possible. She knelt on the stone floor, her scarred face bathed in the dim light of her lantern, and began to clear the grate. She had brought a few scraps of dry kindling hidden in her apron. As the small flame caught and began to lick at the wood, she felt a surge of quiet fury. How could they? How could his own blood leave him to freeze in a tower while they argued over the weight of his crown? She realized then that the royal physicians weren't just incompetent, they were being paid to be absent. They were providing the prince with the mercy of neglect. With the fire beginning to cast a golden glow over the room, Mina returned to the bedside. Silas was awake, though his eyes were clouded with the fog of fever. He watched her move, his gaze following the silhouette of the girl with the jagged scar. To him, she was a flickering shadow, a dream born of his failing mind. He tried to speak, but only a dry, rattling wheeze escaped his throat. Mina didn't shush him. Instead, she reached out and gently laid a cool, damp cloth across his forehead. She saw him flinch at the contact, a testament to how long it had been since he had felt a touch that wasn't clinical or cruel. "Easy, sire," she whispered, her voice like the rustle of dry leaves. "The fire is lit. The room will be warm soon." She began the slow, painstaking process of cleaning him. She used a basin of water she had warmed by the new fire, washing the sweat from his neck and the grime from his hands. As she worked, she talked to him. She didn't talk of politics or the kingdom, but of the small things. She told him about the way the morning mist hung over the flour mills, and how the kitchen cat had finally caught the mouse that had been stealing the cheese. She talked to him like a person, not a monument, and she saw the tension slowly leak out of his frame. He wasn't the great lion of Oakhaven to her in this moment. He was just a man who was cold and alone. Feeding him was harder. His throat was constricted, and he seemed to have forgotten how to swallow. Mina sat on the edge of the bed, supporting his heavy white-haired head against her shoulder. She felt the surprising heat of his fever through her thin tunic. She used a small wooden spoon to drop the milk-soaked bread into his mouth, waiting with infinite patience for him to take it. Every time he managed to swallow, she felt a small victory. It was a slow, agonizing dance with death, but Mina was used to laboring for small rewards. She spent hours in that position, the king's head resting against her, his breathing eventually syncing with hers.
In the silence of the tower, Mina's mind wandered to the heirs. Earlier that day, she had overheard Princess Hestia complaining that the king was taking an unseemly amount of time to depart. Hestia had already begun commissioning a new set of mourning gowns, made of the finest black silk from the southern provinces, while Cassian was seen reviewing the palace guard, demanding oaths of loyalty that should have still belonged to his father. They weren't just waiting for him to die, they were pushing him toward the edge with their indifference. Mina looked down at the king's face, now softened by the warmth of the room and the nourishment she had provided. He deserved to know that someone was standing guard. As the hours ticked toward dawn, the king's eyes opened again. This time, there was a terrifying clarity in them. He looked directly at Mina, his gaze traveling from her eyes down to the scar on her jaw. He didn't look away in disgust. Instead, his hand drifted up, his fingers trembling as they hovered near her face. He didn't have the strength to touch her, but the intent was there. A question formed in his eyes, a silent why. Why was a servant risking her life for a man who didn't even know her name? "Because you were kind once," she answered the unspoken question, her voice cracking. "And because the world is too dark to let a light like yours be snuffed out by those who didn't build it." The king's fingers dropped back to the silk, but the look in his eyes changed. The hopelessness that had been there for weeks was replaced by a spark of something sharp and dangerous. He was starting to realize that he wasn't being outmaneuvered by destiny, but by his own children. He looked at the fire she had built, the first warmth he had felt in months, and then back at the girl. He realized his life was being sustained by a pantry maid, while his loyal court waited for the bells to toll.
Mina knew she had to leave. The sky outside the narrow window was turning a bruised purple, signaling the approach of the morning. She stood up, her joints aching from the hours of sitting still, and began to pack away her things. She made sure to hide the tea leaves and the wood scraps, leaving the room looking as abandoned as possible, save for the dying embers in the hearth. She leaned over one last time, tucking the heavy velvet blankets around Silas's shoulders. "I will come back tomorrow," she promised. As she reached the door, she heard a sound that made her freeze. It was a whisper, so low it was almost indistinguishable from the wind, but it was unmistakably a human voice. "Wait," the king rasped. Mina turned, her hand on the cold iron latch. Silas was watching her, his head lifted just an inch from the pillow. The effort of that single word seemed to drain him, but his blue eyes were burning with a renewed intensity. "What is your name?" he managed to ask, the syllables coming out in a jagged, painful rush. "Mina, sire," she replied, dipping a small, quick curtsy in the shadows. He repeated it, a silent movement of his lips, as if memorizing the sound. Mina didn't wait for him to say anything else. She slipped out of the room and down the stairs, her heart racing. She had crossed a line.
She was no longer just a servant providing comfort, she was an accomplice in a king's survival. As she reached the bottom of the stairs and merged with the early morning bustle of the kitchens, she saw Prince Cassian walking across the courtyard with a group of advisors. He was laughing, a loud, booming sound that felt like a slap. He thought the throne was already his. He had no idea that in a forgotten tower, a girl with a scarred face was slowly rebuilding the man he had tried to bury.
Whispers of the Forgotten. The third night arrived with a heavy, oppressive fog that rolled off the surrounding moors, swallowing the palace towers in a gray shroud. Inside the kitchens, the atmosphere was frantic. Prince Cassian had ordered a celebratory feast for his birthday, a lavish display of excess that felt more like a coronation rehearsal than a genuine celebration. Mina worked in the periphery of the chaos, her hands moving mechanically as she plucked pheasants and diced root vegetables. Her mind, however, was miles away, climbing the stone steps of the old turret. She could feel the weight of the king's silence in her very bones. She had managed to secrete a small jar of beef marrow broth and a bundle of fresh lavender, which the old women said could settle a restless spirit. When she finally slipped away, the palace was a cacophony of clashing silver and drunken laughter. The heirs and their cohorts were celebrating a future built on a grave that hadn't been dug yet. Mina navigated the servants' passages with the grace of a cat, her heart only steadying when she reached the relative silence of the north wing. As she entered the king's chamber, she was relieved to find the room still held a ghost of the warmth from the previous night's fire. Silas was awake, sitting propped up against the headboard, a position that must have cost him an immense amount of agony. His eyes were no longer clouded, they were sharp, tracking her every movement with a hunger for reality that startled her. "Mina," he said. The name was clearer tonight, though his voice still sounded like stones grinding together. He didn't ask for water or medicine first. He simply watched her as she rekindled the hearth. "You are the girl from the charcoal village, the one with the fire in her eyes." Mina froze, a piece of kindling halfway to the grate. She looked up, her scarred cheek catching the orange glow of the growing flame. "You remember, sire? It was 10 years ago. I was just a child in the soot." "I remember the way you didn't look down," Silas rasped, a ghost of a smile touching his pale lips. "Everyone else looked at their boots. You looked at me as if I were just a man. I think I needed that even then." He coughed, a deep rattling sound that shook his thin frame, and Mina was instantly by his side, holding a cup of the herbal infusion to his lips. He drank greedily, his hands shaking as they brushed against hers. "Tell me, Mina, tell me what they say of me in the kitchens. Tell me the truth that the physicians are too well paid to utter."
Mina hesitated. She looked at the king, seeing the vulnerability beneath the royal title. To lie would be a mercy, but she sensed that Silas was done with mercies. He wanted the cold, hard steel of the truth. "They speak of you in the past tense, Your Majesty," she said softly, her voice steady despite the tremor in her heart. "They say the crown is already being resized for Prince Cassian. They say the kingdom is being sold in pieces to pay for Princess Hestia's whims. They think you are a ghost that hasn't realized it's dead yet." The king's jaw tightened, the muscles working under his thin skin. He didn't look surprised, only deeply, profoundly disappointed. "I raised wolves," he whispered, more to himself than to her. "I thought I was raising lions, but I only taught them how to bite the hand that fed them. And the people, my people, do they miss their king, or do they simply fear the new one?" Mina thought of the charcoal burners, the millers, and the washerwomen who worked until their fingers were raw. "The people are forgotten, sire. They are like the dust under the palace rugs. They don't have the luxury of missing you. They are too busy wondering if they will have bread tomorrow.
But they remember the peace you kept. They remember when the law meant something more than the prince's latest mood. She began to tell him stories then, stories of the common folk that never reached the ears of royalty. She told him of the weaver who had lost his sight, but still guided his children's hands by the feel of the thread. She told him of the festivals in the lower town, where the music was loud and the beer was cheap, but the laughter was real. She gave him the kingdom he had lost sight of from the heights of his throne. As she spoke, Silas seemed to grow stronger, his spirit drinking in her words like the parched earth drinks rain. He realized that his children were not the kingdom. These people, these forgotten souls like Mina, were the true heart of Oakhaven.
"I have been a fool," Silas said after a long silence, his gaze fixed on the dancing flames. "I built a wall of gold and etiquette around myself, thinking it was protection. I didn't realize it was a cage. I let my children grow into monsters because I was too busy being a king to be a father. And now, the only person who sees me, the real me, is a girl who should, by all rights, hate the very ground I walk on." "I don't hate you, sire," Mina said, her hand resting momentarily on his blanket. "I think you were just a man who forgot that even a mountain can be worn down by the wind if it stands alone." The emotional tension in the room was palpable. It wasn't the tension of a courtly romance, but something far more primal, the bond between the savior and the saved, between the powerful and the powerless. Silas reached out, his hand finally finding hers. His skin was dry and hot, but his grip was becoming firmer. He looked at her scar, and this time he reached up and traced the edge of it with a trembling thumb. Mina didn't flinch. She felt a warmth spread from his touch that had nothing to do with the fire in the hearth. "You are beautiful, Mina," he whispered, "not because of the skin, but because of the soul that refuses to be burned away. You have more royalty in your little finger than my daughter has in her entire body." Mina felt a lump form in her throat. No one had ever called her beautiful. In the kitchens, she was the marked one or the quiet shadow. To hear it from a king, even a dying one, felt like a benediction. She stayed with him as the hours bled into the night, sharing her broth and her stories. She taught him how to breathe through the pain, coaching him like a mother would a child. But as the first light of dawn began to gray the window, the reality of their situation came crashing back.
A heavy tread sounded in the hallway outside, a sound that shouldn't have been there at this hour. Mina's blood turned to ice. She scrambled to hide her supplies under the bed, her breath hitching in her throat. Silas gestured frantically toward the heavy velvet curtains that flanked the window. Mina dove behind them, pressing her back against the cold stone wall just as the door creaked open. It was Prince Cassian. He smelled of expensive tobacco and stale wine, his clothes disheveled from the night's revelry. He didn't come to the bedside out of love. He came to check the progress of the end. He stood over his father's bed, his shadow falling across the king's face like a shroud. "Still clinging on, old man?" Cassian muttered, his voice dripping with a casual, terrifying cruelty. "You always were stubborn, but the sun is rising on a new Oakhaven. I've already signed the decree to dismantle the southern garrison. We don't need soldiers when we have gold to buy our enemies." Silas remained perfectly still, his eyes closed, feigning the very sleep that was slowly being stripped from him. He didn't move a muscle, but behind the curtains, Mina could see his knuckles whitening as he gripped the sheets. The prince laughed, a cold, hollow sound, and reached out to snuff the candle Mina had lit. "Sleep well, father. It won't be long now. The vault is waiting, and I have much to spend." As the prince turned and walked out, the silence he left behind was louder than any shout. Mina stepped out from behind the curtain, her face pale and her eyes wide with terror. She looked at Silas, who was now sitting up, his eyes burning with a cold blue fire that she had never seen before. The great lion wasn't just awake, he was enraged.
The betrayal of his son had done what no medicine could. It had given him a reason to live that was rooted in justice rather than survival.
"He is selling the kingdom," Silas said, his voice a low, dangerous growl. "He is selling the very dirt our ancestors died for. Mina, I cannot die, not yet. I cannot leave my people to a man who sees them as coin." He looked at her, and in that moment the power dynamic shifted. He was no longer just the king, and she was no longer just the maid. They were two people standing against a tide of greed. "I need your help, Mina, not just to live, but to fight. They think I am a corpse, let them think it. But you and we are going to show them that a crown is not taken, it is earned." Mina felt a surge of loyalty so fierce it brought tears to her eyes. She knelt by the bed, taking his hand in both of hers. "Whatever you need, sire, I am your shadow. I am your eyes and ears in the dark." The king leaned forward, his forehead touching hers. "Then the game begins, my brave girl. Go now, before they see the light in your eyes." Mina slipped out, her mind already racing with the dangers ahead. She knew that the vultures were circling, but for the first time, she believed that the lion still had claws.
The vultures circle. The palace of Oakhaven had become a marketplace of shadows, where the currency was betrayal and the cost was a man's soul. In the week following Prince Cassian's cold midnight visit, the atmosphere within the stone walls shifted from somber anticipation to a frantic, greedy energy. Mina, moving through the servants' corridors like a needle through silk, observed the rot firsthand. She saw Princess Hestia meeting with foreign merchants in the dead of night, trading the royal emeralds for chests of untraceable gold. She watched Prince Cassian dismiss the most loyal of his father's guard, replacing them with mercenaries whose only allegiance was to the coin in their pockets. The vultures were no longer just circling. They had landed, and they were tearing the kingdom apart before the heart had even stopped beating. Every night Mina made her perilous journey to the old turret, her heart a drumbeat of terror and defiance. She had become an expert in the language of the palace, the specific creak of a floorboard, the rhythm of a guard's patrol, the smell of the prince's expensive tobacco. She brought more than just tea now, she brought intelligence. While she scrubbed the floors of the council chamber or polished the silver in the dining hall, she kept her ears open, gathering the fragments of the heir's treachery to piece together for the king. She was the bridge between the world of the powerful and the reality of the dying, and every night she watched Silas grow stronger on a diet of herbal broth and righteous fury. "They are selling the Iron Hills, sire," Mina whispered one night as she knelt by the bed, her hands steady as she changed the dressings on the king's bedsores. "Princess Hestia has promised the mining rights to the southern conglomerates in exchange for a fleet of pleasure ships and a palace in the sun. The miners are to be evicted from their homes by spring."
Silas sat upright, his back straighter than it had been in years. The gray wasting that had threatened to claim him was receding, replaced by a lean, hungry strength. "The Iron Hills were the backbone of my father's reign," he rasped, his eyes flashing like polished steel in the firelight. "To sell them is to cripple our defense. Cassian is a fool. He thinks gold can buy safety, but gold only invites more thieves. And what of the North? What of the border lords?" "They are being told you have already passed, sire," Mina said, her voice heavy with the weight of the lie. "Cassian has intercepted your seals. He sends out letters in your name, claiming you are too weak to see visitors and that he speaks with your voice. The border lords are confused, and many are already turning their gaze toward our neighbors for protection. The kingdom is fraying at the edges, and the prince is holding the scissors." The king's hand clenched into a fist, the knuckles white and sharp. "He has the seal, but he does not have the soul of Oakhaven. Not yet." He looked at Mina, his gaze softening for a brief second. "You are risking everything for a man who can barely stand, Mina. Why?
Is it truly just for a silk handkerchief from a decade ago? Mina paused, her fingers resting on the edge of the basin. She looked at him, really looked at him, not as a monarch, but as a man who had been stripped of his power and left to die by the very people he had loved. In the kitchens, they say that power is like the sun. It burns anyone who gets too close. But I saw you kneel in the soot. You were the only person in this palace who ever saw me as a human being before I was a servant. If I let you die here in the dark, then I am no better than the people who burned my village. I choose to believe that Oakhaven is better than the greed of your children. I choose to believe in you."
The emotional weight between them was a physical thing, a bond forged in the crucible of shared danger. Silas reached out, his hand covering hers. It was no longer the weak, fluttering touch of a dying man, but the firm grip of a leader. "Then we must move faster. My strength is returning, but I am still a ghost in my own house. I need to see the maps. I need to know which guards are still loyal to the crown and not the purse." But their secret sanctuary was nearly shattered that very night. Just as Mina was preparing to leave, the sound of heavy boots echoed in the stairwell, not the rhythmic pace of a lone guard, but the heavy, synchronized thud of a patrol. Mina's breath hitched. There was no time to hide behind the curtains. The footsteps were too close. Silas, with a surge of strength that surprised them both, grabbed Mina's arm and pulled her toward the shadowed corner behind the massive oak wardrobe that housed his ceremonial robes. "Don't move," he breathed, his voice a ghost of a command. The door swung open with a violent crash. Prince Cassian entered, followed by two of his new mercenaries. He looked agitated, his face flushed with wine and anger. He didn't even look at the bed at first. He began pacing the room, his spurs jangling against the stone floor. "Search it," he barked at the guards. "The girl in the kitchens mentioned seeing a light in the window last night. If someone is sneaking up here to steal the king's remaining jewelry, I want their head on a pike by morning." Mina pressed herself into the corner, the scent of cedar and old parchment from the wardrobe filling her nose. She could see the guards through a narrow crack in the wood. They were systematic, overturning chairs and poking their swords into the dusty corners of the room. One guard moved toward the wardrobe, his hand reaching for the very door she was hiding behind. Mina closed her eyes, praying to any god that was listening.
"Looking for silver, Cassian?" The king's voice rang out, cold and clear. It wasn't the voice of a dying man. It was a rasp of iron. The guard froze, his hand inches from the wardrobe. Cassian whirled around, his eyes widening as he looked at his father. Silas was sitting up, his eyes wide and piercing, though he kept his body draped in the shadows of the bed curtains to hide the fact that he was no longer the skeleton he had been a week ago. "You're awake," Cassian said, his voice a mixture of shock and irritation. "The physicians said you were drifting." "The physicians are as blind as they are expensive," Silas replied, his voice dropping to a dangerous low. "I was dreaming of the kingdom. I was dreaming of the way you are mismanaging my counsels. Tell me, son, why are my guards searching my sick room like common thieves? Do you think I've hidden the treasury under my pillow?" Cassian recovered quickly, his face twisting into a mocking smile. "I am merely ensuring your safety, father. There are rumors of intruders. Naturally, I wanted to be certain you weren't being disturbed in your final days." He stepped closer to the bed, his hand resting on the hilt of his sword. "You look remarkably alert for a man on the brink. Perhaps the air in the turret is better than we thought, or perhaps you are simply refusing to accept the inevitable." "The inevitable is a long way off, Cassian," Silas said, his eyes never leaving his son's. "Now take your dogs and leave. The smell of your ambition is making it hard for me to breathe." Cassian's jaw tightened. For a moment, Mina thought he might draw his blade then and there. The tension in the room was a taut wire, ready to snap.
but the prince simply bowed, a shallow, insulting gesture, and signaled to his men. "As you wish, Majesty. Rest while you can. The coronation is already being planned. It would be a shame for you to miss the preparations for your own funeral." As the door slammed shut and the sound of the boots faded down the stairs, Mina collapsed against the wall, her legs shaking so violently she had to sit on the floor. Silas leaned back against the headboard, his chest heaving with the effort of the confrontation. The silence that followed was heavy with the realization of how close they had come to the end. "He knows," Mina whispered, her voice trembling. "He doesn't know about me, but he knows you are more than a corpse. He will be more careful now. He will be more dangerous." Silas looked down at her, his eyes filled with a fierce protective light. "Then we shall be more dangerous too. He thinks he is a vulture, Mina, but he has forgotten that vultures only eat what is already dead. I am still the king of Oakhaven, and you are the heartbeat that keeps me alive." He reached out his hand, and Mina took it, her fingers gripping his with a strength she didn't know she possessed. The tower was no longer a prison, it was a fortress. But outside, the storm was gathering, and Mina knew that the next time the door opened, they might not be so lucky. The game of shadows had become a war of survival, and the Pantry Maid was the only soldier the king had left.
A glimpse of light. The candle between them burned with a steady golden flame, a stark contrast to the guttering, dying light that had defined King Silas's room for weeks. The danger of Prince Cassian's visit had passed, leaving behind a charged, electric silence that seemed to pull the very walls of the turret closer. Mina sat on the floor by the bedside, her fingers absent-mindedly twisting the hem of her coarse linen apron. She was still trembling, the adrenaline of the near discovery coursing through her veins like ice water. Silas, however, was looking at her with a clarity that felt heavier than any crown. He wasn't looking at the servant who brought him tea. He was looking at the woman who had stood between him and the abyss. "Come here, Mina," Silas said, his voice no longer a rasp, but a low, resonant hum that vibrated in the small room. Mina hesitated, then rose to her feet. She stepped into the pool of candlelight, the orange glow illuminating the jagged line of her scar. Usually she kept that side of her face turned away, a habit born of years of mockery from the other kitchen staff. But Silas reached out, his hand steady and warm, and placed his palm against her cheek. He didn't pull away. He didn't flinch. He used his thumb to trace the ridge of the scar, his touch as light as a falling leaf. "I remember the fire now," Silas whispered, his blue eyes searching hers. "Not the one that marked you, but the one in your soul. I remember thinking that day in the village that the world was a cruel place for a girl with eyes so full of defiance. I gave you that handkerchief because I wanted you to know that someone saw the strength behind the sook. I had forgotten, Mina. God forgive me, I had forgotten so much of what it meant to be a man because I was so consumed with being a king."
Mina felt a tear prick at the corner of her eye, hot and sudden. "You were a good king, sire. The people still speak of the years of the great harvest and the peace treaties you signed with the mountain clans. You gave us stability. That is more than most rulers ever offer."
"Stability is a cold comfort when the heart of the kingdom is rotting," Silas countered, his hand sliding down to clasp hers. He pulled her slightly closer, forcing her to sit on the edge of the mattress. The proximity was startling. She could smell the cedar of his robes and the sharp medicinal scent of the willow bark tea. "I spent my life building a legacy of stone and law, thinking it would endure, but look at what it produced. Cassian is a creature of greed, and Hestia is a void of vanity. I failed them, Mina, and in failing them, I failed Oakhaven." "You cannot take the blame for the darkness in their hearts," Mina said firmly, her voice regaining its strength. They chose to be vultures. You chose to be a lion, and lions do not apologize for the nature of the scavengers. A small, genuine laugh escaped Silas's throat, the first real sound of mirth Mina had heard from him. It transformed his face, smoothing the deep lines of pain around his mouth, and making him look, for a fleeting second, like the vibrant ruler of the old stories. You have a silver tongue for a girl who claims to be a quiet shadow. Where did you learn to speak with such iron? From watching you, sire, she admitted, her face flushing. From the stories the elders told, and from the long nights in the kitchen, listening to the world move while I stayed still. You learn a lot about the mountain when you spend your life at its base.
The romantic tension in the room shifted, deepening into something more profound than mere attraction. It was the intimacy of two survivors recognizing themselves in each other. Silas leaned forward, his forehead coming to rest against hers. It was a gesture of immense trust, a surrender of the royal distance he had maintained for decades. Mina closed her eyes, breathing in the warmth of him. In this drafty, forgotten tower, the social chasm between a king and a pantry maid had vanished, burned away by the shared heat of their defiance. "When I stood today," Silas whispered, "when I looked my son in the eye and felt the blood rushing through my limbs again, it wasn't the thought of the throne that gave me strength. It was the thought of you hiding behind that wardrobe. I realized that if I died, they would find you. They would destroy you because you are the only witness to their shame. I realized I had to live, not for the crown, but to protect the only person who actually cares if I draw another breath." Mina pulled back slightly, her heart racing. "I am just a maid, Silas. I am a ghost in your halls." "No," he said, his voice dropping to a whisper of fierce intensity. "You are the light that showed me the way out of the grave. You are the heartbeat of this tower. And if I reclaim my kingdom, I will not do it to return to the cold, lonely throne I once occupied. I will do it to build something worthy of the woman who saved me." He reached out and took a small silver ring from the nightstand, one of the few personal items Cassian hadn't yet bothered to steal. It was a simple band, engraved with the seal of the white oak. He took Mina's hand and pressed the ring into her palm, closing her fingers over it. "This is not a gift for a servant," he said solemnly. "It is a promise. If the dawn comes and I am still standing, you will never scrub another floor, Mina. You will never have to hide your face again. I will make the world see you as I see you, as the true nobility of Oakhaven." Mina looked down at her closed fist, the cold metal of the ring warming against her skin. She felt a wave of terror and hope so powerful it left her breathless. The stakes had moved beyond simple survival. They were dreaming of a future, a concept that felt like treason in a palace ruled by Cassian's shadow. But as she looked into Silas's eyes, she saw a man who was no longer waiting for the end. He was a king preparing for war, and for the first time, Mina felt like she wasn't just a shadow in the corner. She was his armor. "The prince will not wait much longer," Mina warned, her voice low. "He is growing impatient. I saw the master of the horse preparing the royal carriage for a procession through the city. He wants to show the people a closed litter and tell them the king is too ill to speak, while he sits in the saddle as the de facto ruler. He is trying to habituate the people to his face before yours is forgotten." Silas nodded, his expression hardening into a mask of regal command. "Then we must give them a different face to look at. I need you to find Captain Thorne. He was the commander of my personal guard before Cassian retired him to the stables. If there is one man in this city who still remembers what an oath means, it is him. Tell him the lion is awake and he is hungry for justice." Mina stood,
the weight of the silver ring heavy in her pocket. "I will find him, sire, but you must be careful. Princess Hestia was seen with the royal apothecary today. They were discussing painless transitions. She does not have the stomach for Cassian's slow neglect. She wants the end to come quickly."
Silas's grip on the bedsheets tightened. "Let her come. Let them both come. They think they are walking through a graveyard, but they are walking into a trap. Go now, Mina, and be careful. The palace is full of eyes, but I will be watching the door until you return." Mina slipped out into the cold night air of the stairwell, her mind spinning. She felt the ring in her pocket, a small piece of the king's world that now belonged to her. The glimpse of light she had seen in the turret wasn't just the candle or the fire. It was the reflection of a man who had rediscovered his soul in the hands of a girl the world had discarded. As she descended the stairs, she knew that the pantry maid was gone. In her place was something far more dangerous to the heirs of Oakhaven. A woman who loved a king, and a king who had finally found a reason to reign.
The Great Betrayal. The air in the palace had turned stagnant, thick with the unsaid and the impending. It was the kind of silence that precedes a landslide, a heavy, vibrating tension that made the stone floors feel fragile beneath Mina's feet. Since her last night with Silas, the pantry maid had moved with a new, dangerous purpose. She had found Captain Thorne in the shadow of the royal stables, whispering the king's message into the ear of a man whose eyes had filled with a sudden, fierce weeping before hardening into flint. But as she returned to the kitchens, she sensed a change in the wind. Princess Hestia was no longer pacing the halls in frustration. She was smiling, a sharp, cat-like expression that boded ill for the man in the tower. Mina took her place at the heavy oak prep table, her knife rhythmically dicing carrots, but her eyes were fixed on the apothecary's assistant, a nervous lad named Pip, who was currently handing a small, violet-colored vial to the princess's personal maid. The exchange was hushed, frantic, and entirely too deliberate. Mina's heart plummeted. Hestia had grown tired of Cassian's slow game of neglect. She wanted the throne, she wanted the treasury, and she wanted the mourning period to begin before the next full moon. The painless transition they had whispered about was no longer a theory. It was a liquid reality tucked into the silk sleeve of a lady-in-waiting. "Mina, stop daydreaming and get those tarts to the cooling rack," the head cook barked, snapping her back to the present. Mina obeyed, but her mind was racing. She had to get to the old turret before that vial did. The problem was the timing. Usually, the death tray was sent up at dusk, but today Hestia had ordered a special restorative tonic to be delivered early, claiming a sudden burst of sisterly devotion. Mina watched as the maid, a girl named Clara who was far too fond of Hestia's cast-off ribbons, began to prepare the tray. She saw the violet vial being emptied into a cup of rich, dark wine, the king's favorite vintage, the one he only drank on feast days. The poison would be tasteless, odorless, and utterly lethal to a man whose heart was only just beginning to beat with strength again.
Mina knew she couldn't stop Clara by force. She was a marked servant, and Clara was the princess's shadow. If she interfered openly, she would be executed before she could reach the first landing. She had to be a ghost. She had to be the shadow she had spent her life becoming. As Clara turned to fetch a silver napkin from the linen press, Mina acted. She tripped, a calculated, clumsy sprawl that sent a pile of tin plates clattering across the stone floor with the force of a small explosion. The kitchen erupted in shouts and startled gasps. In the 3 seconds of absolute chaos, as the head cook screamed at Mina for her clumsiness, Mina reached out. Her hand, stained with carrot juice and calloused by lye, darted to the tray. She didn't take the wine. Instead, she switched the cups. Earlier, she had prepared a cup of identical dark wine, laced not with poison, but with a powerful sedative she had scavenged from the herbalist's stores, something that would induce a deep, death-like sleep but leave the heart beating. It was a desperate gamble.
If Silas drank it, he would appear dead to anyone who checked his pulse briefly. It was the only way to buy time for Captain Thorne to gather the Loyalists. But she had to be sure the poison didn't reach him. Her fingers brushed the silver chalice, and for a heartbeat, time slowed. She felt the cold metal, the weight of the king's life in her palm. She swapped the cups with a blur of motion that even the most observant thief would have envied. By the time Clara turned back, breathless and annoyed by the noise, the tray looked exactly as it had before. "Useless girl," Clara hissed, stepping over the fallen plates as she hoisted the tray. "It's a wonder you haven't burned the palace down by now."
Mina stayed on the floor, her head bowed, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She watched the hem of Clara's skirt disappear through the service door. She had done it, or had she? The terror of the what-ifs began to claw at her throat. What if the sedative was too strong? What if Silas, sensing the danger, refused to drink at all? Or worse, what if Cassian arrived and insisted on a toast? She couldn't wait. She scrambled up, ignoring the cook's continued vitriol, and vanished into the servants' stairs. She didn't go to her room, she ran. She took the narrow vertical shafts meant for chimney sweeps, her lungs burning, her scarred face scraped by the rough soot. She had to see. She had to know. She reached the secret crawl space behind the tapestries of the king's chamber, just as Clara was curtsying at the bedside. Through a small tear in the ancient fabric, Mina saw Silas. He was sitting up, his face a mask of regal indifference. He looked at the wine cup with a deep, instinctive suspicion. "A gift from your daughter, Majesty," Clara chirped, her voice trembling slightly. "She says she prays for your swift recovery." Silas took the cup. He looked at the dark liquid, then his eyes drifted toward the tapestry where Mina was hiding. It was as if he could feel her presence, her heartbeat drumming against the stone. He saw the slight tremor of the fabric. He knew. In that silent exchange of souls, he understood that the wine was a weapon, either his daughter's or Mina's. He didn't hesitate. He raised the cup to his lips and drained it in 3 long swallows. Clara beamed, took the empty vessel and hurried out, no doubt to collect her reward from Hestia. Mina waited, her nails digging into her palms. Within minutes, the sedative began to work. Silas's eyes grew heavy. He looked toward the tapestry one last time, a ghost of a smile touching his lips, a smile that said, "I trust you," before his head fell back against the pillows. His breathing slowed until it was almost imperceptible. To any casual observer, the great lion of Oakhaven had finally succumbed. The door burst open less than 10 minutes later. It wasn't the physician, it was Hestia and Cassian together. They didn't come with tears, they came with a cold, clinical curiosity. "Is it done?" Cassian asked, his voice low and jagged.
Hestia stepped to the bed, her silk skirts rustling like a nest of vipers. She reached out and touched her father's hand. It was cold from the draft of the room and the slowing of his blood. She leaned down, her face inches from his, checking for the rise and fall of his chest. "He is gone," she whispered, her voice trembling not with grief, but with an ecstatic, terrifying triumph. "The king is dead." Cassian let out a long, shuddering breath. He walked to the window and looked out over the kingdom he now believed was his. "Then the coronation is tomorrow at noon. We don't wait for the mourning period. The people need a leader, and I have waited long enough in this man's shadow." "And the girl?" Hestia asked, her eyes narrowing as she looked around the room. "The one the guards mentioned? The one who was seen with the light?" "She is a servant." Cassian dismissed her with a wave of his hand. "A loose end we will tie up tonight. I've already sent the guards to the kitchens to find the scarred one. No one will care if a pantry maid disappears in the confusion of a royal passing." Mina's blood turned to ice. They were coming for her. She looked at Silas, lying still and gray on the bed, and realized the magnitude of her position. She was the only person who knew the king was still alive, and she was currently the most hunted person in the palace. She couldn't stay here, and she couldn't go back to the kitchens. She turned and fled back through the dark passages, her mind a whirlwind of fear and determination. She had to find Thorn. She had to stay alive long enough for the sedative to wear off, and for the king to wake up in a house full of enemies. The great betrayal had reached its zenith, but as she slipped into the night air of the inner courtyard, she felt the silver ring in her pocket. It was a cold reminder that a promise made by a king was stronger than the poison of a princess. The vultures thought they were attending a funeral, but Mina was going to make sure they were attending a reckoning.
The Lion Awakens. The stone walls of the palace seemed to shrink around Mina as she scrambled through the narrow masonry of the servants' passage. Above her, the great bells of Oakhaven began to toll, a heavy, rhythmic iron weeping that announced to the world that King Silas was dead. To the peasants in the fields and the merchants in the square, it was the end of an era. To Mina, it was a countdown. She knew the sedative would hold Silas in a state of death-like suspension for only a few hours. If he woke while Cassian's guards were preparing his body for the state funeral, they would finish what the poison had failed to do. She had to move faster than the grief of a kingdom. She burst out into the cold air of the stable yards, her breath coming in ragged white plumes. The palace was in a frenzy. Light spilled from every window as servants scrambled to hang black bunting, and nobles arrived in haste to swear fealty to the new regime. Mina stayed to the shadows of the haylofts, her eyes searching for the silhouette of a man who didn't belong in the mud. She found him near the back stalls, his hand resting on the flank of a massive warhorse that had once carried the king into battle. Captain Thorn looked up, his weathered face illuminated by a single lantern. "The bells, girl," Thorn said, his voice a low rumble of suppressed fury. "You said he was recovering. You said the lion was awake." "He is," Mina gasped, grabbing the leather of his jerkin. "He tried to poison him. I switched the vials. He isn't dead, Captain. He is sleeping. But if we don't reach him before the prince's men prepare him for the vault, he will be murdered in his bed. You have to gather the men, now." Thorn's eyes sharpened, the spark of the old soldier returning to his gaze. He didn't ask for proof. He saw the silver ring on Mina's finger, the seal of the white oak gleaming in the lantern light. "I have 12 men hidden in the lower town, men who would die for Silas. But the palace is crawling with Cassian's mercenaries. We can't fight our way in, not without starting a civil war on the palace steps." "Then don't fight your way in," Mina said, her voice dropping to a fierce whisper. "The coronation is at noon tomorrow. Cassian wants a public spectacle to cement his power. He will bring the king's body to the great hall to honor him before the crown is placed on his own head. That is when we strike. We let them bring the king to us."
Thorn looked at her, a slow, grim smile spreading across his face. "You have the heart of a general, little maid. Go, hide in the crypts. I will signal the men. If the king wakes, tell him his sword is waiting." Mina didn't wait for a farewell. She slipped back into the palace, avoiding the main thoroughfares where guards were already rounding up any servant who looked suspicious. She made her way back to the old turret, her heart in her throat. When she slipped through the door, the room was eerily quiet. The prince and princess had left to begin their celebrations, leaving only 2 junior priests to keep watch over the corpse. They were nodding off over their prayer books, the scent of heavy incense filling the room. Mina waited in the shadows behind the wardrobe until the priests stepped out to find some tea to keep them awake. The moment the door clicked shut, she was at the bedside. She took a cold cloth and began to scrub at Silas's face, trying to shock his system back into awareness. "Silas," she whispered, her voice a desperate plea. "Silas, wake up! The bells are ringing for you, but you aren't ready for the earth yet." For a long, terrifying minute, there was no response.
The king's skin was ice cold, his pulse so faint she had to press her ear to his chest to hear the slow, rhythmic thud of his heart. Then, with a sudden, violent gasp, his eyes snapped open. He bolted upright, his hand instinctively reaching for a sword that wasn't there. He gripped Mina's shoulders, his fingers digging into her skin as he fought for breath. "The wine," he managed to choke out, his eyes wild with the remnants of the drug. "It was a sleeping draught, sire," Mina explained, her hands steadying him. "Your daughter tried to kill you. The palace thinks you are dead. Cassian is crowning himself at noon."
Silas slumped back against the pillows, the fog of the sedative clearing to reveal a cold, crystalline rage. He looked at his hands, which were no longer shaking. The drug had forced his body into a deep, restorative rest, and the fury in his soul was doing the rest. He thinks he can step over my body to reach the throne? He thinks he can bury me while I still have breath to curse his name? "We have Thorn," Mina said, her voice filled with a quiet strength. "And we have the people. But you are weak, Silas. You can barely stand." The king looked at her, and for a moment the romantic tenderness they had shared was replaced by the raw, unyielding power of a monarch. He took her hand and pulled himself to the edge of the bed. His legs buckled, but he refused to fall. He leaned on Mina, his weight heavy and real. "I have spent months dying in this bed," Silas said, his voice gaining strength with every word. "I have been a ghost, a memory, a burden, but tonight I am none of those things. I am the king of Oakhaven, and I will not be ushered into the dark by a boy who hasn't learned the weight of a crown." He looked at Mina, his gaze softening. "You saved me again, Mina. You snatched me from the very mouth of the grave. Why do you keep risking your life for a man who has nothing left to give you but a promise and a scarred name?" "Because you are the only man I have ever known who is worth the risk," Mina whispered, her face inches from his. In the dim light of the dying fire, Silas reached out and cupped her face. This time, he didn't just trace the scar. He leaned in and pressed a kiss to her forehead, a gesture of such profound reverence that it made Mina's breath hitch. "If we survive tomorrow," he promised, "you will never have to be a shadow again. We will walk through the front gates together, or we will not walk through them at all." The rest of the night was a blur of preparation. Mina helped Silas dress in his oldest, simplest tunic. Anything more would be too heavy for his recovering frame. They practiced walking, Silas leaning on her shoulder as they paced the small room, his strength returning in agonizingly slow increments. Every time he faltered, Mina was there, her small frame acting as the pillar for his kingdom. As the sun began to bleed over the horizon, painting the sky in shades of bruised purple and gold, the heavy tread of the honor guards sounded in the hallway. They were coming to collect the body for the procession to the great hall. "This is it," Mina whispered, her hand tightening on the silver ring in her pocket. Silas stood in the center of the room, his back straight, his eyes burning with a fire that no drug could extinguish. He looked like a man carved from the very mountains of his kingdom. "Hide behind the bier, Mina. Stay close to the shadows. When the moment comes, I will need you to show them the truth." The door opened, and Prince Cassian entered, draped in a cloak of royal purple, a smirk of triumph on his face. He didn't even look at his father's corpse as the guards lifted the heavy oak bier. He was too busy looking at the crown he had placed on a velvet cushion. "Take him down," Cassian commanded, his voice echoing in the stone room. "Let the people see what happens to kings who live too long." Mina slipped into the shadows of the funeral shroud, her heart hammering against her ribs. The lion was awake, and the vultures were leading him right into the heart of their own nest. The hunt was over. The reckoning was about to begin.
The Trial of the Maid. The great hall of Oakhaven was a cavern of cold stone and flickering torchlight, transformed into a theater of forced mourning.
Black silk banners draped from the vaulted ceiling, brushing against the iron chandeliers that groaned under the weight of 1,000 candles. At the far end of the hall, upon the raised dais, sat the ancient throne of white oak, looking strangely diminished beneath the shadow of Prince Cassian. Below it, resting on a stone plinth, was the king's funeral bier. Silas lay there, a statue of marble and silence, his hands folded over the ceremonial sword he had supposedly carried into the afterlife. To the gathered nobility and the terrified servants lining the walls, he was a memory. To Mina, crouching in the suffocating darkness behind the heavy velvet hangings of the dais, he was a coiled spring. The ceremony was a hollow mockery of tradition. Prince Cassian stood at the head of the bier, his face a mask of practiced grief that didn't quite reach his hungry eyes. Beside him, Princess Hestia fanned herself with a lace handkerchief, her gaze darting toward the royal treasury doors. The high priest stepped forward, his voice droning through the ritual of the passing, but the air in the room was electric with something other than sorrow. It was the smell of a coup. "Our father has left us a legacy of peace," Cassian's voice boomed, echoing off the shields of fallen heroes. "But peace without strength is merely an invitation to ruin. As I take this crown, I vow to prune the rot from this kingdom, starting with the shadows that infested my father's final hours." Mina felt a cold sweat break across her brow. This wasn't just a coronation, it was a purge. Cassian signaled to the captain of the new guard, a man with a scarred face and a soul of lead. "Bring her forth!" The heavy oak doors at the back of the hall groaned open. 2 guards dragged a woman into the light. For a terrifying second, Mina thought they had found her replacement. But as the figure stumbled into the torchlight, she realized it was Clara, Hestia's personal maid. The girl was trembling, her fine silk dress torn and her eyes wide with a frantic animal terror. She had been the one to carry the tray, and now she was to be the scapegoat. "This girl," Cassian shouted, pointing a gloved finger at the weeping servant, "was seen hovering over the king's bedside with a vial of unknown origin. Under questioning, she has confessed to a conspiracy, a plot orchestrated by a faction of loyalists and a certain scarred pantry maid who has since vanished into the dark." A murmur of shock and horror rippled through the crowd. Mina's heart hammered so loudly she was certain the guards could hear it through the velvet. They weren't just killing the king, they were framing his only friends to ensure no one would ever question the natural causes of his death. "Where is the girl, Mina?" Cassian demanded, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous hiss that carried to every corner of the hall. "Where is the creature who poisoned the well of our lineage? Guards, search the shadows. If she is not found, every servant in the north wing shall face the rack until the truth is bled from them." The hall erupted into chaos. Guards began tearing at the tapestries, their boots thundering on the stone. Mina looked at Silas. He remained perfectly still, but she saw the slight rhythmic pulse at the base of his throat. He was waiting. He was waiting for the moment the prince placed the crown on his head, the moment of ultimate hubris. "There!" a guard shouted, pointing toward the heavy hangings where Mina was hidden.
A hand reached through the velvet, seizing Mina by the shoulder. She was dragged out into the harsh, judgmental light of the great hall, her scarred face exposed to the hundreds of nobles who looked at her with a mixture of pity and revulsion. She was thrown to her knees at the foot of the king's bier, her hands bound with rough hemp rope. "The Pantry Maid," Hestia sneered, stepping down from the dais to loom over her. "The little marked girl who thought she could play at being a queen's shadow. Tell us, girl, did you enjoy watching him fade? Did you think your little herbs would buy you a place in the new order?" Mina looked up, her eyes burning with a fire that made the princess recoil. "I watched him live," Mina said, her voice surprisingly steady, a rasp of iron that cut through the murmurs of the court.
I watched him breathe while his children were already dividing his heart like common coin. I didn't poison him, princess. I saved him from the venom you poured into his cup." The hall went deathly silent. Cassian's face turned a bruised purple. He stepped forward, his hand flying to the hilt of his sword. "Blasphemy! You will hang for this, and your tongue will be the first thing the crows eat." He turned to the high priest, his voice trembling with rage. "Enough of this theater. The king is dead, and the traitor is caught. Place the crown on my head so I may pass judgment on this filth." The high priest, trembling, lifted the crown of the white oak from its velvet cushion. It was a heavy thing of gold and ancient silver, encrusted with raw emeralds. As it descended toward Cassian's brow, the prince leaned down, his eyes fixed on the throne, his ego expanding to fill the room. At that exact moment, a sound like a thunderclap echoed through the hall. It wasn't the sound of a door or a weapon. It was the sound of a hand slamming against the wood of a coffin. Silas sat up.
The transition from corpse to king was so sudden, so violent, that the high priest dropped the crown. It clattered across the stone floor, the sound of gold on granite like a death knell for the prince's ambitions. Silas didn't just wake, he erupted. He stood on the bier, his shroud falling away to reveal the simple tunic of a warrior. In his hand was the ceremonial sword, and as he drew it, the steel sang a high, predatory note that chilled the blood of every man in the room. "Who," Silas roared, his voice the sound of a mountain breaking, "gives you the right to judge my people in my house?" The silence that followed was absolute. Cassian fell backward, his legs giving out as he collapsed onto the steps of the throne he had almost claimed. Hestia let out a thin, piercing shriek, her lace handkerchief fluttering to the floor like a dying bird. The nobles fell to their knees as if struck by a physical blow, a wave of bodies descending in a sea of velvet and fur. Silas stepped off the bier, his movements fluid and powerful, the last remnants of the drug burned away by a decade's worth of fatherly disappointment. He walked toward Mina, his eyes never leaving his son's. He didn't look like a man who had been at the brink of death. He looked like a god who had returned to find his temple defiled. "You speak of rot, Cassian?" Silas asked, his voice dropping to a low, terrifying whisper as he reached the girl on her knees. He took the sword and with a flick of his wrist sliced through Mina's bonds as if they were made of cobwebs. "You speak of pruning the shadows? Then look at the sun, boy. Look at the man you tried to bury." He reached down and took Mina's hand, pulling her to her feet. He didn't hide her behind him. He placed her at his side, his arm firmly around her shoulders. "This girl," Silas announced to the hall, his voice carrying to the rafters, "is the only reason your king still draws breath. She is the only reason Oakhaven still has a soul. And you," he turned his gaze to his children, his eyes as cold as the northern stars, "you are no longer my blood. You are the vultures I allowed to nest in my eaves. And today the wind has changed." At that moment, the doors at the back of the hall burst open again. Captain Thorne and his 12 loyalists entered, their armor clanking, their swords drawn. Behind them, the palace guard, seeing their king standing tall, dropped their spears in a synchronized salute. The rebellion was over before it had truly begun. The trial of the maid had become the execution of a legacy.
The purge of the palace. The silence that followed the king's resurrection was more deafening than any battle cry. It was the sound of 1,000 hearts stopping in unison, a collective gasp that seemed to suck the very air from the great hall. Prince Cassian remained sprawled on the steps of the throne, his fingers clawing at the cold marble as if trying to find a secret door into the earth. Princess Hestia had shrunk against a fluted pillar, her face a mask of such profound, ugly terror that she looked decades older than the girl who had sipped wine while her father suffocated.
King Silas stood over them, his hand still firmly clasped around Mina's, his presence expanding until he seemed to dwarf the very rafters of the hall. "You thought the lion was sleeping," Silas said, his voice a low, vibrating rumble that shook the candles in their sockets. "But the lion was merely watching. I saw you, Cassian, measuring the weight of my crown while I still felt the heat of my own breath. I heard you, Hestia, whispering of painless transitions, while this girl, this child of the soot, was the only soul in this palace who brought me a drop of water without a price attached to it." He stepped forward, the point of his ceremonial sword tracing a slow, agonizing line across the stone floor toward his son's throat. Cassian scrambled backward, his royal purple cloak catching on the sharp edge of the dais. "Father, please, it was the physicians. They told us you were gone. We only sought to protect the kingdom from the chaos of a vacant throne." "Protect the kingdom?" Silas roared, the sound echoing like a thunderclap. "You sold the Iron Hills to the highest bidder before my heart had even skipped a beat. You dismissed my generals to hire mercenaries who wouldn't know an oath if it were branded on their chests. You didn't protect Oakhaven. You carved it up like a carcass at a hunter's feast." He turned his gaze to the nobility, who remained frozen on their knees. "And you who have dined at my table for 40 years, you watched as my children dragged me to a drafty tower to die in the dark. You smelled the rot and called it perfume because you were afraid of the new master's whip. Shame on you. Shame on every man in this room who forgot that a crown is a burden of service, not a license for greed."
Captain Thorne stepped forward, his heavy boots echoing with a finality that signaled the end of the old order. "The mercenaries have laid down their arms, sire. The city gates are secured, and the people are beginning to gather in the square. They heard the bells of the passing, but now they hear the shouting of the king. They are waiting for a sign." Silas looked down at Mina, his expression softened, the cold iron of the monarch melting into the warmth of the man she had sat with in the dark. He reached out and tucked a stray lock of hair behind her ear, his thumb grazing the edge of her scar with a tenderness that silenced the room. "The sign they receive today will not be one of death," he whispered to her, loud enough for the front rows to hear. "It will be one of justice." He turned back to his children. "Cassian, Hestia, you wanted the kingdom? You shall have the kingdom of the exiles. You are hereby stripped of your titles, your lands, and your names. You will be escorted to the southern border by dawn. If you ever set foot on Oakhaven soil again, you will be treated as common thieves and executed without trial. Go, take the gold you so dearly loved, but know that you leave behind the only thing that ever mattered, the respect of your people." Guards moved in, seizing the former prince and princess. Hestia wailed, a shrill, broken sound, while Cassian looked at the floor, his pride finally shattered by the weight of his own failure. As they were dragged from the hall, the atmosphere shifted. The oppressive weight of the coup vanished, replaced by a tentative, flickering hope. Silas didn't climb the throne. Instead, he stayed on the floor of the hall, at the level of the people. He raised his sword high, the steel catching the morning light that was finally beginning to stream through the high, narrow windows.
"Oakhaven is not a map," he shouted. "It is not a treasury or a collection of emeralds. It is the breath in our lungs and the truth in our words. Today, we begin again, and we begin with the knowledge that nobility is found in the heart of a pantry maid as surely as it is found in the blood of a king." He looked at Mina, his eyes shining with a deep, romantic fire. "Mina, you came to me when I was nothing. You saw the man beneath the shadow. I asked you once why you risked your life for me, and you said it was because I was kind once. Now I ask the kingdom to be kind to you, for you are no longer a servant of the kitchen. You are the heartbeat of the throne." The nobles began to cheer, not the forced, fearful cheers of a coronation, but a roar of genuine, cathartic relief. Thorn and his men hammered their shields, the rhythmic thudding sounding like the heart of the kingdom starting to beat again. Amidst the noise, Silas leaned in, his forehead resting against Mina's. "The tower is empty, Mina," he whispered, "but the garden is waiting. Shall we walk?" Mina felt the silver ring in her pocket, no longer a hidden secret, but a public promise. She looked at the king, the man who had died and lived again in her arms, and felt a joy so sharp it was almost painful. The purge was over, the vultures were gone, and for the first time in her life, the girl with the scarred face was standing in the full, unyielding light of the sun.
The Queen of the Hearth. The seasons of Oakhaven turned with a sweetness that the kingdom had not known in a generation. In the wake of the Great Restoration, the palace was no longer a tomb of marble and silence, but a living, breathing house of service. The old turret remained, its stones weathered by the wind, but it was no longer a place of exile. It had been transformed into a sanctuary for the city's orphans, a place where the smallest and most forgotten were fed and taught that their lives held value. King Silas ruled with a hand that was firm, yet tempered by the memory of the cold dark, and by his side, constant as the North Star, was the woman who had pulled him from it. Mina did not wear a crown of gold, for she said the weight of it was too heavy for a head that preferred the sun. Instead, she wore a simple circlet of white oak leaves, the very symbol of the kingdom she had saved. She had refused the title of queen for many years, content to be the king's advisor, his confidant, and his heart. But on a morning when the apple blossoms were snowing down upon the palace gardens, Silas knelt before her in the damp grass, far from the prying eyes of the court. He held her hand, the one that still bore the faint scars of the kitchen fires, and asked her not as a king, but as a man who would be lost without her. "I have a kingdom, Mina," he whispered, his blue eyes clear and full of a love that had only deepened with time. "But it is merely dirt and stone if you are not there to give it meaning. Will you rule not over the people, but with me, as my equal, in all things?"
Mina looked at the man who had been a dying skeleton and was now a lion in his autumn. She saw the kindness he had rediscovered, the justice he had restored, and the way he looked at her scar as if it were a badge of the highest honor. She leaned down and kissed his brow, a gesture that mirrored their first night in the tower. "I will," she replied, her voice no longer a rasp, but a steady, melodic song. Their wedding was not a secluded affair of the nobility, but a feast that spilled out into the streets of the charcoal burners and the squares of the weavers. The Pantry Maid and the king walked hand in hand through the crowds, proving that the true lineage of a ruler is not written in blood, but in the courage to care for the least among them. As the sun set on their first day as husband and wife, they stood on the balcony of the great hall, looking out over a land that was finally at peace. The greedy heirs were a fading memory, but the story of the girl who brought tea to a dying king became the legend that would sustain Oakhaven for 1,000 years.